shy is that on the other side of
Well, good morning.
Oh, no.
Can you hear me okay? Is that loud enough?
Morning, you old bullshit.
Okay, I want to make sure you can hear today. I'm Larry Malcolm, the President of the World Affairs Council in Greater Hampton Roads, and on behalf of our entire Board of Directors and membership, welcome to Great Decisions 2019. Today we're going to conduct the second in our series of 8 programs that are actually, the topics are chosen by the Foreign Policy Association in New York, distributed nationwide, and majority of our 94 World Affairs Councils around the country associated with the World Affairs Council of America conduct these programs every year, and they've been most popular here in the Hampton Roads area. I invite you, the way to do this thing right is to get you one of these books, because the books have articles on each of these topics, and they're written by prominent experts in the country, and they do their research right up until December of in this case, 2018, and then they quickly print them all up and they distribute them to the councils around the country. But you read the article, and the article contains some pretty straightforward questions about this topic that you can think about, and also, you know, stump our speaker with it maybe. But you read the article, and then we have a presentation by an expert from our own community, and then we have a great discussion session afterwards. So it's quite a tradition here at Hampton Roads, but that's the way you do it right if you want to. The World Affairs Council, as you know, is a nonprofit, nonpartisan educational organization. And it's been here in Hampton Roads for almost 50 years, and we're working to engage and educate the public in international affairs and foreign policy. By continuing to answer this question, we always ask ourselves, what in the world is going on? And it's even more important this year than in years past. And we do it through a series of programs each year. Great Decisions is one of them, and we have several other programs that we conduct throughout the year. You know, Thomas Jefferson firmly believed that an educated citizenry is absolutely required for our survival as a nation, especially in a democracy. And we hope to continue to contribute to that effort of educating our citizens on international affairs. In today's world, it could not be more important to do that. I'd like to thank our partners and our sponsors and our individual donors who allowed us to continue to conduct our programs such as these, and actually offer them free of charge to our students and our educators. Their investment in this program is investment in the future of our community, so we thank them. We'd like to especially thank Norfolk Academy for the use of their facility, and the City of Norfolk Arts and Humanities Commission for their generous grant, which allows us to continue to operate this particular council. And so today's topic on cyber conflict and geopolitics could not be more timely, or I think are more appropriate. Remember last week, if you were here, Dr. Xiaomin Li talked about intellectual property theft and China's involvement in this, and we'll continue with that discussion today. I think cyber conflict is one of the newest and one of the most challenging forms of military and global tensions, I think, in the world today. And the future of that, which way it goes, is going to affect us all. It'll affect us personally, and it'll affect our national security as well. So what I'd like to do is turn the program over to Dr. Matthew Hall, who's the chairman of our Great Decisions Committee, and he will introduce our speaker for today. Matt?
Good morning.
Good morning.
Today, I'm going to, bear with me, switching over to my cheaters, because I'm using index cards, because today's speaker has a long career in a subject matter that we all recognize is important. We all see it in the daily news, right? And especially when it comes to the international law aspect of it, I think most of us recognize we probably don't actually know that much about it. I certainly know that's the case for myself. I was talking to another one of our distinguished guest, I won't name him, before about this subject just a few minutes ago, about how much we were looking forward to this talk. No pressure. And I quoted him, and he said, in relation to this subject, there's a vast emptiness in my brain. I really like that. Mine too. So, again, it's my honor to introduce our speaker, Jude Klena, on this topic. I want to say just a couple things about expertise. I've got a few students from my classes in here, and that's hearing the word expertise is probably going to make them groan, because this is a subject that comes up in my classes. But I promise this isn't going to take very long. I think that it's a subject I think about a lot, and I think it's important. And I think there's multiple types of expertise. And I think that the Great Decision Series obviously pulls experts from the fields and subfields and gets them to discuss their experience and knowledge. There are different types of expertise. There's the academic, theoretical expertise. There's a specific sort of discipline or sector or industry expertise. And then there's the practical, experiential, in the field expertise. And it seems to me that today's speaker has all of those. So, Jude Klena has just finished a distinguished 30-year career with the Navy in November. He retired from the reserves. He grew up in Centre County, Pennsylvania, in let's see if I get it right. I had the date here. 1985, perhaps? Was it 1985? He got his BS in mathematics from the University of Pittsburgh, after which, in '88, I believe, he got his Juris Doctorate from William and Mary, and after that he joined the Navy. For 6 years, he was with the Navy Judge Advocate. Some of his positions were with the Office of the Undersecretary of Navy, with the U.S. Naval Academy, with the Naval Legal Services Office in Yokosuka, Japan. In 1994, his active duty ended. He, at that point, ventured out. He was head counsel with House Counsel for the University of Maryland. He went back to his hometown and practiced law there with a firm. And then in 1997 began his civilian service with the Navy here in Norfolk. And he's done a wide variety of things, far too many to list. I'll fast forward to 2007, and that's when he began working in the field that he's going to discuss today. First as the counsel to the commander of the Naval Network Warfare Command, and then in 2010 he began with the counsel for Navy Cyber Forces. His current position is with counsel for the Navy Information Forces. So, in this relatively young discipline, by definition, our speaker today has been working for well more than a decade. So, he brings that practical knowledge, and he brings probably as extensive as you're going to find in this field. And having said that, let's all welcome our speaker, Mr. Jude. One last thing, we are going to turn the lights low, just to give you a little heads up here. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you Dr. Balcom. Thank you, Dr. Hall, and thank you, Dr. Rosamond, for affording me the opportunity to be here this morning. Thank you all for coming out. I hope that we don't disappoint during the course of this presentation. I want to make a couple things clear up front. One, I'm definitely not an expert. I have experience. As Dr. Hall said, I have about 11 years of experience working in this field on different issues, both through my civilian job and then through the reserve job that I've had over the past few years. So I have the lake is broad and deep in some areas and very shallow in others. So the second part of this, I understand, will be Stump the Chump, and we'll give you the opportunity to do just that. So what I want to talk to you today about is cyber conflict and international law. And a great question was asked to me before, and I hadn't addressed this before. What is international law? What does that mean? International law comes from two sources primarily. It's treaty-based, so it's treaties that countries, nations enter into with each other, where they agree to do certain things and not to do certain things, and then what the consequences of doing or not doing certain things are. So that's the one basis for international law, is treaties. The United Nations is a treaty, for instance. So all the member nations have agreed to be bound by the articles and other edicts and such sort put out by the United Nations. The other way, and the more common way, or I shouldn't say more common because I'm not an international law expert by any means, is through what we call customary international law. And this is just the way that states have interacted with each other for years and years since states started to form in the Middle Ages in Europe primarily. So customary international law. An example of that, and we'll cover this, is a concept called sovereignty. That is you won't find sovereignty written down in any treaty anywhere, but it is something that has evolved through the practice of states over the years. So that's what we're talking about here when we talk about international law. Next slide, please. I am still currently an employee of the Department of Defense, Department of the Navy, so I must give you all this warning, this disclaimer up front. The views expressed today are my own and do not necessarily reflect those of the Department of the Navy or the Department of Defense. Everybody got that? Good. Next slide. Okay, so we're going to talk today about something called the Tallinn Manual 2.0. And this just shows you quickly what my thoughts are, what I'm going to try to convey to you about the Tallinn Manual 2.0. What is it? Why was it created? What purposes does it serve? I forgot to put who created it. And then we're going to take a look at the tail end of the presentation at a couple of applications of the Tallinn Manual to real-world situations. Next slide, please. So let's start up front by defining what is a cyber operation, and this is the definition that you would find in the Tallinn Manual. It's the employment of cyber capabilities to achieve objectives in or through cyberspace. Achieve objectives in or through cyberspace. So there's a couple things we need to talk about here first. So what are cyber capabilities? What does that mean? Cyber capabilities are those kind of instruments, or in some cases now they're almost weapons, that nations can employ against other nations to deny, degrade, disrupt, or destroy information or information systems. Or in certain cases they can use them to destroy equipment as well. And we'll talk about an example of a cyber operation that had an effect on equipment as we get to the end of the presentation. In or through cyberspace. So what is cyberspace? Great question. You ask 10 different people, you'll get 10 different answers. Cyberspace commonly is thought of as having three components. The first component is what they call the hardware layer. The hardware layer is things like the computer that's over there. Your smartphone is part of the hardware layer. Your tablet is part of the hardware layer. Anything that is a device that allows you to connect or communicate with others through the internet or through a cyber means as part of the hardware labor. It also includes things like the fiber optic cables that carry the data back and forth, or the satellite transmissions that carry the data back and forth. That's considered part of the hardware layer of cyberspace. The second layer is the logical layer. And the logical layer is simply, it's the ones and the zeros, it's the software, it's the thing that makes the hardware layer work, okay? It's the things that transmit that data or allow that data to be transmitted through the internet, through the fiber optic cables. So it's your programs, it's the ones and zeros that make the internet kind of work. So that's the second layer of cyberspace. And then the third layer, I'm looking at the third layer, and you're looking at the third layer. The third layer is called the social layer, and that is the people, the individuals that are actually getting on and using those computers, using those smartphones, using those tablets to communicate back and forth or to send data back and forth through the internet. So those are the three layers of cyberspace. This, as we go through, just kind of keep those in mind. They all apply equally as we talk about this. Next slide, please. A little bit of a scene setter for you. Why is this thing called the Tallinn Manual 2.0? And anyone in the room familiar with Tallinn, Estonia? Anyone been to Tallinn, Estonia? Beautiful place? Beautiful place. Yes, it is. Beautiful place. Tallinn is the capital of Estonia. Estonia is a Baltic country with a large border with Russia. Until 1991, Estonia was part of the Soviet Union, gained their independence in 1991. 13 years later, in 2004, Estonia joined NATO and got all the rights and privileges of being a NATO nation. In 2007, Estonia rather, was subjected to some pretty serious cyber operations in April of 2007. What had happened? Two things I have to tell you first. Estonia is not a very large country, small population, kind of geographically spread out, so due to their demographics, they rely on technology a great deal. It's amazing the amount of investment they have made in being able to do things what we would call online. They are very technology dependent, so that's important to keep in mind. So these cyber operations occurred in 2007 when the government of Estonia decided to move a statue that commemorated Soviet war dead from a location in downtown Tallinn out to a military base on the outskirts of town. Some folks were very upset by this. We're not sure who it was. I don't think there's ever been any official attribution, but the response was Estonia found themselves on the receiving end of some fairly significant cyber operations, primarily in the form of what we call DDoS attacks, denial of service attacks, distributed denial of services attacks, which had the effect of shutting down the people's ability to access certain governmental websites, businesses, banks, and really had a profound effect on Estonia. It only lasted for a brief period of time. The Estonians recovered, came back, moved on. The statue did get moved. And as a response to all this, the Estonian government said, we need to start looking at cyber as a kind of disciplinary, academic. We need to take this. We, Estonia, need to be at the forefront of learning about cyber, particularly in military kind of operations. And so in 2008, they established the Cooperative Cyber Defense Center of Excellence, and I'm using the European, the way they spell it there. So CCD-COE was formed in 2008. Next slide, please. So CCD-COE, what is it? The Cooperative Cyber Defense Center of Excellence. It is a NATO-accredited knowledge hub, research institution, and training and exercise facility. It is staffed and financed by the member nations, but, this is important, it is not part of NATO's military structure or command or force structure. So it is a recognized center of excellence that supports NATO, but is technically not part of the command or force structure. What do they focus on? Interdisciplinary applied research, consultations, training, and exercise in the field of cybersecurity. That is their reason for existence, and they do it very, very, very well. have 17 sponsoring nations, the last I looked. The United States is one of them, meaning we contribute money to them. Estonia obviously as well. United Kingdom, several other NATO nations, but not all NATO nations are sponsoring members. They host an annual conference on cyber conflicts. The first one, I believe, was in 2009, which is when I got the opportunity to go to Tallinn for that. And it was great, bringing together all these incredibly smart people. And there's the website for them if you're interested. They have lots of information in English about the center, about what they've done, and it's just a very useful place to go look if you're curious. Next slide, please. So the Tallinn Manual 2.0 sort of gives you an indication that there was a Tallinn Manual 1.0, and there was. So what was Tallinn Manual 1.0? In 2009, actually, it was the tail end of that first cyber conference, Conference on Cyber Conflict. A group of people were pulled together who had come to that conference, and they were sort of led by two folks, Mike Schmidt, who's an American. He's currently at the Naval War College. He's been doing this, really doing this for about 20 years. And if there's truly somebody who's an expert on cyber law, it's Mike Schmidt. And Eniken Tick, who was an attorney at the CCD COE, pulled together a bunch of people and said, hey, we need to develop a manual on the law of cyber conflict, or cyber warfare as it relates to international law on warfare. Okay, so we need this. The time is right. There's so much uncertainty out there. There's a lot of smart talking heads out there writing this law review opinion or this law review opinion. We need to pull that all together into a manual that people can go to and look at. Their examples were the San Remo Manual on International Law Applicable to Armed Conflicts at Sea, which came out in 1994 and is considered, a go-to source for considering questions on the application of armed conflict at sea. And then in 2009, Harvard's Program on Humanitarian Policy had come out on the Manual on International Law Applicable to Air and Missile Warfare. So you have two manuals out there on air and missile warfare, one on conflicts at sea. There's a much older one, I believe it was Cambridge or Oxford, that dealt with law of armed conflict on land. Cyber's the new domain. Let's get out ahead of this. Let's create a manual on this. So what they did was they convened an independent group of legal experts, about 17 of them, I believe, from all kinds of different nations, and they put together Tallinn Manual 1.0. Next slide, please. So Tallinn Manual 1.0 was titled The Manual on International Law Applicable to Cyber Warfare. It came out in 2013, focused on two areas. Cyber operations involving the use of force, which we call jus ad bellum, and then cyber operations that occur in the context of armed conflict. So it's cyber operations just as precursors to war, to armed conflict, leading up to it, and then what is the international law on cyber operations once an armed conflict is underway. Came out and was pretty well recognized, great achievement in the field, but it was lacking. And they soon recognized that it was lacking in one way, and that is if you look at cyber operations, they go across a continuum, and they start way down here, maybe with crime, move through intellectual property, espionage, and it just escalates up the spectrum until you reach conflict or armed conflict. What Tallinn Manual 1 dealt with was things at the very far right of that spectrum. Well, most things that are happening in the world are occurring way away from that spectrum, and they're occurring way down at the other end of the spectrum. So they decided we need to revise the manual, we need to expand the manual, and we need to start looking at some of the things that are occurring in peacetime. So they expanded the scope to include the public international law governing cyber operations in peacetime. They pulled together a new group of international experts, and they started working on what will become Tallinn Manual 2.0. The new group of international experts included some folks from, I think there were Chinese, Japanese, perhaps Russian, so they expanded the scope of the international experts as well, which I will talk about, led to some interesting discussions. Next slide, please. So there it is. Here it is. Tallinn Manual 2.0 on the international law applicable to cyber operations. It's about 600 pages long, available from Cambridge University Press. That is not an advertisement for them. Next slide, please. So, 2017, the Tallinn Manual 2.0 comes out on the international law applicable to cyber operations. Not cyber warfare now, remember? It's cyber operations, so they've greatly expanded the scope. What Tallinn Manual 2.0 is not, and what Tallinn Manual 1.0 was not, is it is not NATO policy or doctrine. When that first came out, there was a lot of confusion in the press that NATO had published this manual on armed conflict, and there was a lot of backing off. No, this is not a NATO official document. This is a NATO Center of Excellence document, or published through the auspices of CCDCOE, but it's not an official NATO document, so it doesn't give NATO policy or doctrine. Similarly, it is not the policy or doctrine of any of the nations that sent people over to help contribute with it. Okay, so the United States had folks participating in the drafting of Tallinn 2.0 and Tallinn 1.0, but that is not, what you find in that book is not official United States doctrine by any stretch of the imagination, or any other country's doctrine for that. What it is a resource for legal advisors throughout the world to go to when you're faced with a particular kind of situation that involves a cyber operation. And I put a quote up here from he's a law professor at Cornell. Although some of the manual statements and conclusions of law are controversial, it is nevertheless undeniable that the document is the most complete rendering of an emerging, but not universal, consensus regarding the law in this area. And that's exactly right. So what you would see if you go through, or when you go through and read the manual, well, go to the next slide, please. I'll come back to that point. So the Tallinn Manual 2.0 is divided up into 4 parts, and broad subject matter categories: general international law in cyberspace, specialized regimes of international law in cyberspace, international peace and security and cyber operations, and part 4, the law of cyber armed conflict, which is basically what was carried over from Tallinn 1.0. Next slide, please. So I'm going to walk through quickly each of the subject matters that are covered in each of these sections, and then we're going to come to, we'll talk about a few of them in a little more detail, because I think perhaps when we get to the Stump the Chump portion of this, I will refer back to these portions. I'm kind of anticipating where the questions might go, but I could be wrong. So part 1, general international law in cyberspace, covers these topics: sovereignty, due diligence, jurisdiction, law of international responsibility, cyber regulations not per se regulated by international law, and underneath that is peacetime cyber espionage. Next slide, please. So I mentioned it earlier, sovereignty, the concept of sovereignty, which arises from customary international law. What does sovereignty mean? Basically, sovereignty means the right of a state to exercise control over its domain, its territory, its civilians, to set up its own form of government, to run things the way it wants to, free from outside interference. That is what the concept of sovereignty is all about. Pretty basic. So 2 rules that I highlight here for sovereignty are: the principle of state sovereignty applied in cyberspace, which means if a violation of sovereignty was prohibited, just because you're engaging in an action or a cyber operation that violates another state's sovereignty, but you're doing through cyber means, does not mean that the law of sovereignty, or the concept of sovereignty, does not apply. And then Rule 4 just says that you must not conduct cyber operations that violate the sovereignty of another state. These are rules that apply in international law in the non-cyber arena as well. So really not much of a change here from what was existing, except to say that we recognize that these concepts exist for cyber and that cyber operations can violate them as well. Next slide, please. Talk a little bit about peacetime espionage as well. So under international law, peacetime espionage is not a violation of international law. Does that surprise anyone here? Espionage is not a violation of international law. Why? Customary practice. Why? Doesn't the United States not get mad about that? Because we do it too. Yeah. What's good for the goose is good for the gander. So, that'll be important, I think, again, as we come back to the question and answer session, that espionage, per se, is not a violation of international law. Now, you see there it says, even when it's conducted through cyber means, which it is being done all the time, right now, as we talk, but there are certain things that you might do through cyberspace which would push you into an unlawful act. And what are those kind of things? What kind of cyber operations, what methods could do that? And there's a concept of the law out there, our international human rights law, which includes the right to privacy. So if you conduct an espionage through cyber means where you're invading another person's privacy, that is a violation of international law, which would then kick this into a violation of international law. Make sense? So if what you're doing, you can call it espionage, but if the method by which you're doing it violates international law by some other means, you've moved beyond this, hey, it's not a problem, it's now a problem. Got that? Come across? Okay, thank you. Next slide, please. Part 2, near and dear to my heart, contains one of more near and dear to my heart. These were specialized regimes of international law in cyberspace. So they looked at particular existing bodies of law, customary or treaty-based, and applied the cyber principles to them as well. So we had international human rights law, the one I just mentioned about everyone has a right to privacy, or there's recognized rights to freedom of expression, privacy, due process, are all recognized as international human rights. Diplomatic and consular law talks about a little bit about what you can do as far as cyber operations targeted at diplomatic and consular folks. Basically, you shouldn't be doing that. Law of the sea, air law, space law, and international telecommunication law. Law of the sea was the one that I participated in, I should say. Next slide, please. Part 3 covers international peacetime and security and cyber operations, and the 4 broad categories under there are peaceful settlement, prohibition of intervention, the use of force, and collective security. So, for instance, NATO is a collective security body, right? Member nations have all agreed that an attack on one could be met with a response by all. Next slide, please. Of these, I've chosen to highlight the prohibition of intervention because this ties back to sovereignty, okay? Rule 66, intervention by states. A state may not intervene, including by cyber means, in the internal or external affairs of another state. Again, the intervention doctrine is out there. It's been established for many, many, many years. What Tallinn Manual 2.0 has done is taken it and said, hey, we believe this applies in the world of cyber operations and cyberspace as well. And again, I think we'll be coming back to this one. Next slide, please. Rule 68 also talks about a concept that is well established outside the cyber world as well, which is the prohibition on the use of force, or the threat or use of force. And once again, a cyber operation that constitutes a threat or use of force against the integrity or political independence of any state, or that is in any other way inconsistent with the purposes of the United Nations, is unlawful. All this is done, again, is taken what is a concept that already exists in international law and applied it to cyberspace, okay? If you threaten or use force against another nation through cyber means, you have violated this rule. The tricky thing becomes, what is a threat of force using cyber, what is an actual use of force using cyber. Those are where, that's where the devil lies. How do we define those terms? And we'll talk about that. Next slide, please. And then the final part is the law of cyber armed conflict. Deals with armed conflict generally, the conduct of hostilities, certain persons, objects and activities, occupation, and neutrality. Again, all these are in the cyber context. Next slide. But what I want to focus on here is the conduct of hostilities. Section 2, attacks generally, Rule 92, the definition of a cyber attack. A cyber attack is a cyber operation, whether offensive or defensive, that is reasonably expected to cause injury or death to persons, or damage or destruction to objects. A couple things to unpack here. Cyber operation, we talked about that at the front. Remember the definition of that was an operation carried out through cyber means in and through cyberspace. Reasonably expected to cause injury or death to persons, or damage or destruction to objects. What I forgot to mention was the Tallinn Manual wouldn't be nearly as lengthy as it is if it just stated the rules and left it there. What follows underneath the rules is a discussion of the application of those rules to the real world. This is kind of important. I should have mentioned this before. I'm sorry. So if you read the manual, you'll see the rule, and then you'll see, depending on the amount of discussion among the experts, a long passage about how that rule is interpreted. And not surprisingly, different folks from different national backgrounds had vastly different interpretations of certain rules. Not necessarily this one, but that's another fascinating and a good part of the Tallinn Manual. So you not just get the rule, but then you also get a discussion on various opinions of how that rule should be applied or ought to be applied across in actual real-world situations. So let's take a look for a few minutes at two actual real-world situations. Next slide, please. Folks in the room familiar with the Sony hack? Okay. This and the next one are all, the factual patterns are taken from Wikipedia, so there's no classified information here. It's all completely open source information. So what happened with the Sony hack? So in 2014, a group, the Guardians of Peace, was a little bit upset that Sony was about to put a movie out that was going to disparage the leader of North Korea. The movie was about an assassination attempt on the leader of North Korea's life. And so they hacked into Sony and gathered all this information, very sensitive information, about Sony employees, salaries, emails, names of their family members, and they put that stuff out, trying to warn Sony, do not release this movie. Okay, we mean business. Then they took it another step further, and they actually implanted malware, malicious software, into Sony's computer system and completely wiped out everything. So they basically destroyed Sony's computer infrastructure. Again, they demanded, do not release that movie. They also coupled it with a threat for physical violence, terrorist activities at theaters that would show it. And as a result, theaters in the United States did not show the movie, would not show the movie. And Sony had to pull its release, except they released it in a digital form, and then in certain select theaters. United States intelligence officials, in response, said, okay, this was North Korea. This was the North Korean government behind this. Don't care what the GOP calls themselves, the Guardians of Peace. Was this an attack by cyber means on the United States? Can you click on the attack again, Dave? I think it's taking us back. Let's look at the definition of an attack. All right. Was it a cyber operation? Yes. No doubt about that. No doubt about it at all. I would characterize as an offensive one. It wasn't defensive. They certainly weren't protecting themselves from an attack that was going on. Was it reasonably expected to cause injury or death to persons? No. No, there was no reasonable expectation of injury or death to persons. How about the last criteria? Damage to or destruction to objects. I got no's, I got yeses. And that's exactly the right answer, no or yes. This is where it gets tricky. My opinion, it was not an attack for a couple reasons, and that was primarily one of them. It wasn't reasonably expected to damage or destroy objects. And when we typically think of attacks, not all the time, especially as we're moving further in the cyber world, we're typically thinking of destruction to physical objects. Here they destroyed data. More importantly, was it an attack against the government of the United States? Was it an attack against an entity or instrumentality in the United States? Was it an attack against what we call critical infrastructure in the United States? Our power supply, our banking system, our food system? Was it an attack on something like that? Was the operation directed at something like that? No.
It was damage to an object, but it would be a private object, not a public.
Correct. Ask the question this way. If somebody had blown up the Sony building, would the United States have gone to war with North Korea? Probably not, no.
Sony wasn't an American company.
Well, it was located in the United States, so
It was not owned by the United States.
it was not owned by the United States, correct. So, no, in my opinion, I think the generally recognized consensus is the Sony hack was not an attack because of the various reasons we've discussed. Kind of a close call. Yes, ma'am?
What about the threat to the theaters that showed it? That
The question was, what about the threat to the theaters that were showing it? That is a great question too. That moves more sort of into the terrorism realm. And so overall, how I would characterize this entire incident, it's a crime. This was a crime committed against, under U.S. law. These were several crimes actually. The hacking in was a violation of the U.S. Code, Computer Crimes Act. The threat to cause bodily damage is another violation of U.S. law, probably California law. So this was a crime. This was a crime that should have been treated under U.S. domestic law, was, I think, in fact, treated under U.S. domestic law, did not rise to the level of an attack as we've defined it here in international law. Yes, sir.
In computer world, there's a concept for components of data and components of applications called objects. Does this term encompass that as well?
The question is, in computer science, there is a definition or a subset, a term of art called objects. Does this term refer to that objects? The answer is, I do not know. But during the break, I will take a look in the manual and see if I can find out for you. Question here.
So the Tallinn Manual, I mean, really, the nuts and bolts of it, it applies to nations, sovereignty of nations, versus, that was a good example. Sony was a criminal act, and you have to take it as a lawyer to the extent of how that affects the sovereignty of a nation, correct? That's what the Tallinn Manual really is guiding.
What you're trying to look at exactly, the question is, so how do what does the Tallinn Manual do in an application of this? And what you're doing is you're taking this particular fact pattern and then looking at everything in the Tallinn Manual and trying to say, where does this fall? Does this even fall into a violation of international law, for instance? Or is it simply a crime under the domestic laws of whatever state where the act was carried out or was perpetrated? So yes, that's what the Tallinn Manual is. I think you've got it exactly right. It's supposed to be a resource for folks to look at and say, okay, this happened, how do I define it? How do I quantify it under international law? Ma'am?
is this the basis for looking at a democratic state different from a totalitarian state where you might perceive the ownership differently between the two?
in terms of where the operation is originating from or where it is targeted at?
The definitions of the result.
No, as far as the Tallinn Manual goes, it's pretty, my understanding is it's rather agnostic. A nation state is a nation state. Now, if you go through, in certain areas like the international human rights law sections, they will differentiate about the types of governments that you're dealing with, but overall, no. A nation state is, regardless of the type of government they have, is considered a nation state for purposes of sovereignty and things like that. Is that answering your question?
Not quite, but I think I'll get there.
Okay. Sir, and I'll get you. Sir.
The manual seems to exclude as long as we don't physically damage something or hurt someone, damage to the economy of the nation. So I can shut down the economy of the country, but still maybe not of an attack.
So the question is, does the manual cover something like, how broadly, I think maybe to get to damage or destruction to objects. So if I take cyber actions that's going to ruin another nation's economy, would that constitute an attack per the Tallinn Manual? And I think what I've done is not give you a very good explanation of how broadly that's interpreted. You read the section underneath when they start to talk about specific instances of what could or could not constitute a cyber attack. The scenario you portray, where through cyber means, even though it may not be directed at governmental entities, but if you're taking down banking systems, if you're taking down electrical systems, if you're doing severe damage to another nation's critical infrastructure through cyber means in a concerted way, I think you've absolutely got an attack. I think you absolutely have got an attack under those circumstances. So you don't always need to have physical destruction. There are certainly other things that I think could rise to the level of attack. Part of the trick here is, for folks who are working in this area, is you want to have some wiggle room on the definition, okay? You don't want to go out to your adversaries and say, here's the line. You cross this line and this is a cyber attack. And we're going to respond with whatever measures are appropriate. Because cyber is always changing. And there's always new things that are coming up, and adversaries are going to either push you to that line or push you across that line to see what you're going to do, and then if you don't respond, the line's no good. So it's much more effective, in my opinion, to leave some gray space there, some ambiguity. Several years ago, I went to I was up at some of the National Defense University, and there was one of the cyber folks from the Joint Staff J3 was there, and was asked the question, what is the U.S. definition of a cyber attack? And his response was classic. We'll know it when we see it. And I believe that. We'll know it when we see it. And I don't think we have seen it yet. Move on if we can. So advance 2 slides, please. Stuxnet. Who in the room is familiar with Stuxnet? Good, good. Okay. So again, Stuxnet is a little different animal. It was a malicious computer worm first uncovered in 2010. It was designed to target Siemens SCADA systems, supervisory control and data acquisition systems. For a layman in the room, such as myself, a SCADA system is just a machine that monitors and runs other machines. Okay, it controls them, takes the human sort of out of the loop, so it can do multiple machines at once. It's checking to make sure they're doing what they're supposed to be doing, at the time they're supposed to be doing it, at the speeds they're supposed to be doing. Stuxnet targeted 5 Iranian organizations with the probable target, the uranium enrichment program that Iran was running. It destroyed up to 1,000 centrifuges in an Iranian government facility, and to date there has been no attribution, meaning no one has stepped forward to take responsibility for Stuxnet. There are lots of speculation out there as to who did it. One of my favorite is from Richard Clark, who is the National Security Advisor for George Bush, in an article in National Geographic a couple years after Stuxnet came out, and he worked in government for many years. He said clearly Stuxnet had to be done by the United States because he saw American lawyers' fingerprints all over it. And what do I mean by that? we have concepts in our law of armed conflict about collateral damage and limiting collateral damage, and his point was the way that Stuxnet had been designed was to limit collateral damage as much as possible, and so clearly only American lawyers would have been that concerned about it to make sure that that got put into Stuxnet, and therefore it had to be an American product. I don't know that that's the case. That's just one man's theory, not mine. So, was Stuxnet an attack? And if you could click back on attack, let's go back to the definition. A cyber operation, yes. And apparently a very, very well engineered, very expensive, costly cyber operation that took a lot of time. Was it offensive or defensive? You could argue, if you're concerned about the Iranian nuclear threat, you could argue it was a defensive operation. I wouldn't personally go there. It was clearly, I think, an offensive operation. Was it reasonably expected to cause injury or death to persons? No. It was targeting that specific Siemens controller, not reasonably expected to cause death or injury. How about damage or destruction to objects? Yes. That was the whole purpose of this malware. Stuxnet was out there to destroy or damage objects, centrifuges in particular. Centrifuges used to purify nuclear fuel for to make nuclear fuel weapons grade. Was Stuxnet an attack under international law? I don't know. My opinion is as good as yours. It certainly looks like it, doesn't it? Certainly seems to meet the criteria. Yes, sir.
Would the out here be that there's no real indication of a sovereign nation attacking the other? So we take responsibility.
That is probably one of the things that is keeping this, yes, is the fact that there is no attribution here. So there is no one that you can point back to and say that is the nation state that launched this attack against Iran. Again, Jude Klena's personal feeling, if something like this was launched against the United States, this sort of goes to your point, sir, some kind of malware targeting some kind of government facility, nuclear power industry, I think we might find that to be an attack. But we'll know when we see it.
Also, the results were something probably the majority of the world were satisfied with. So that would go into the keep the lawyers quiet, they were not going after them.
That's a very good point. Iran's kind of isolated, so who exactly are they going to go complain to about this? That's a very good point. So go back up, and I think that was my last slide. Yeah, keep going. Yeah, so it's now, I think we're going to take a break and then come back for questions and answers, and we'll have a more full and frank discussion. Any more questions before you take a little break? All right, we'll be back when? 10 after, so 15 minutes, we'll be back.